open meeting. I think it's our first open meeting being done by online means, and the team who worked very hard to get the papers out to everybody, but also to make this work. Fingers crossed it goes smoothly this morning. I'm sure lots of people have got a wealth of experience from this in the last 2 or 3 months. So can I just remind everybody that because this isn't a normal public meeting, the meeting is being recorded and it will be put on the Science Council website so that anyone can access that in due course. So I'd just like to note that, and I should have started by actually saying that I'm Sandy Thomas, even though I know most of you, and I know we've all helpfully got our names on our screens. Just to note that Heather Hancock, FSA Chair, will be joining us from 10:30, so we look forward to seeing her. And I'd also like to welcome Robin May, whose picture I can't see at the moment. Robin, I can see you. No, that's Rick. So I can see Robin. Is Robin with us?
I am, Sandy. I can see myself, but apparently you can't see me.
Oh, no, I can see you now. Now you've spoken, I can see you. That's great. So
thanks very much.
Really welcome to Robin May, who's the Chief Scientist, CSA FSA Designate, I think is the correct term, and you'll be replacing Guy really quite shortly. So what I'd like to do is also welcome our 3 new members, one of whom is joining us this afternoon, Professor Peter Gregory. We've also got Jonathan this morning, Jonathan Waisling, who's joined us for the first time from Keele, and also Claire Nicholson is with us too. So I would just like to ask Robin, excuse me a second, I would just like to ask Robin and Claire and Jonathan all just to very briefly introduce themselves. So why don't we start with Robin?
Good morning. Thank you very much, Sandy, and really nice to meet all of you over this slightly bizarre medium that we're getting used to. One day I will meet you in person and realise what everyone looks like from the neck down, but at the moment it's just head up. Yes, very briefly, so I'm Professor of Infectious Diseases at the University of Birmingham. My background is really in human infectious diseases. We've worked for a long time on opportunistic infections of HIV patients and intensive care patients and those kind of things. So I guess I have a background in microbiology and immunology, but very much not in food, as I keep telling everyone as my kind of caveat. So I will be relying very heavily on lots of advice and wisdom, and for you all to put me well and truly back in my place when I get something astronomically wrong. I'm really looking forward to the role. It's quite exciting, quite daunting. Guy has been briefing me very regularly, so I'm feeling as equipped as I possibly can be, but bear with me as I find my feet, and I'm looking forward to taking over next month. Thanks very much.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Robin. Can we go to Jonathan, please?
Good morning, everybody. Yes, my name's Jonathan Waisling. My current role is I'm Pro Vice Chancellor and Executive Dean of Natural Science at Keele University. But my background is in infectious diseases, actually in zoonotic infectious diseases and diseases of livestock. Previously worked at University of Liverpool, and actually with Sarah, which I can see you there, Sarah. Hi. And so we've got some common interests there on microbiology and infectious diseases. So my role at the moment is very much an institutional role, although I do carry on with some active research in the area. I'm looking forward to the Science Council and learning some new things, I hope, and hopefully contributing in a positive way to the work of the council.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Claire? I think you're on mute, Claire.
No, I'm not on mute. Can you hear me now? Yes, sorry about that. Okay, so I have had some involvement with the FSA for quite a long time now, which came about after I left Sainsbury's, having been there over a decade in various consumer type head office roles. So first of all, I was involved with the FSA on a consumer committee, and then that led on to me being the consumer representative on the ACNFP. And concurrent with that, I've also, until January this year, been the consumer representative at Red Tractor Farm Assurance. on their board. And then as that came to an end, I started looking for other roles to add into my time. And this role on the Science Council came about. So I've now, as of yesterday, been to my last ACNFP meeting and now joining the Science Council, hopefully bringing a consumer perspective to all the things you think about.
Okay, well, thank you very much, both of you, for giving us that background, and to Robin. We'll hear from Peter Gregory this afternoon at the closed session. Now, we do have a full agenda today, and we need to keep the timetable. Remind council members, I'd like to remind you that to speak freely, but also to make your points succinctly. We will assume that you have read the papers in advance. There has been quite a lot of paperwork, and particularly thanks to the team for doing all that. Now, I'd just like to ask Chun Han to run through housekeeping issues, including what's happening with the audience and also register of interest. Chun.
Hi. Just ask that when you're not speaking, to ensure that microphones are muted. This especially goes towards audience members. And with audience members, please keep your cameras off so we can focus purely on the beautiful faces of the council. So audience members will be invited to raise any questions at the end of the meeting during the Q&A agenda item. After receiving any questions from the audience, if there are any questions that have been submitted by the public at the head of the meeting, these will be read out to the council for response. If we run out of time, all questions will be answered in writing by the Secretariat. We'll note that questions from the audience should be on Science Council activities, and these will be welcomed. The council, however, cannot answer questions on FSA or FSA policy in general. So now I'll move on to the register of interests and check with all members whether they wish to declare any current or historic interests that may be relevant to any of the items that we'll be discussing today, particularly mindful of any interests that may not have been declared before. I will also ask that if these can be sent through email, so they can be put on the record by close of play by the 3rd of July. If there are any interests that are declared, we need to determine whether they represent a conflict, and if so, we will need to manage this proportionately. Secretariat can help with this, and in practice, it's unlikely that any interests would represent serious conflicts given the strategic nature of Science Council discussions. That's it from me. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks very much for that, Chun. I don't think, have we got any questions at this point to Chun? No? Okay, so we're going to move on to the next agenda item, which is agreeing the draft minutes from the 6th meeting and then going through the actions arising. So you've got a copy of the minutes of the meeting that was held 17th of December. That seems quite a long time ago. And you might recall we held that in the Wellington Hotel. Are there any comments on those minutes, and is everyone agreed to them? Any comments?
Sandy?
Yes, John?
John, just a very quick small point. On page 12, I would just recommend that JLA is spelled out, James Lind Alliance, just especially for the new members.
Oh, this is in halfway down.
Halfway down, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. That's the James Lind Alliance.
James Lind Alliance.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll make that alteration. Any other comments on those minutes? No. Well, I'm going to take those minutes as agreed. So we've now got a paper which is Chun is going to present to us, which is the register of actions. I'm very pleased to see that nearly all of these are in hand. Chun, to run through those?
Yeah, so on the document with the minutes, I refer to agenda item 4. I won't cover the ones that are completed because we have got a tight agenda, but we've got 2 that are ongoing. So this is action December 19/4. CSA and council members to report on progress engaging with FSA and non-FSA advisory committees over the next 6 months. And this is an action for the FSA CSA as well as council members. Any comments on that?
This is 19/19/4, you said?
Yes, yeah.
So we've got, so this is looking ahead, or this is looking ahead over the next 6 months. What we've got, the item is later on the agenda, isn't it? Where we,
yes, I believe it is. So I don't know if you want to make any particular points just now, or would you prefer to leave it for the agenda item later on?
Well, I think we do cover that in the update, the SAC update later towards the end of the morning. And also I will be updating very shortly on some of the other meetings. So I think we're probably all right on that, John.
Okay, great. And then the next one is Action December 19/12. And this is Secretariat to review Science Council members with regards to attendance to Science Advisory Committee meetings. Again, this one's going to be discussed under item 8A and 8B, so we will not cover that one just yet. And the final one, which is an ongoing one, is just to remind all Science Council members when that Secretariats will prompt you when expenses are due, and make sure that this is at least a week before the end of the financial quarter. So that's an ongoing one. That's it for actions.
Okay, thank you very much. Has anyone got any comments on those actions? No, is that a raised hand, Guy?
No, it's not.
Okay.
I'll comment about the non-FSA committees when you're talking about it later.
Yeah,
about
yes.
the intro. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, your image has frozen for a moment with your hand raised, so that's why I asked you. Okay, so we're going to move now to the next item, in which I'm pleased to give my biannual report as chair of the Science Council over the last 6 months. And I have got a set of slides which I think the Secretariat is going to share with you, and you've probably already had these in advance. So could I have the first slide shared, please? Okay, thanks very much. So I'm just going to, so the second slide, please, I should be asking for. So we'll just run through these fairly quickly. If I could have the next slide. So I thought I'd start by saying something about the meetings that I have had outside of the meetings where we joined together since December. And I just got the ones listed there that I'm going to say a little bit about. The FSA board meeting in January, which focused on the EU exit, the hypersensitivity strategy, of which we, of course, are contributing, the third annual report from the social science area, and also the FSA risk analysis process update, which we've had a particular interest in, given that this was one of our early working groups. Also had a meeting with Patrick Valance, which I'll say a few words about. I was pleased to catch up with Heather in April, and then just very recently I had a meeting with ACSS chair Susie Mitchie, and I think that's been very useful because I think it shows that there are opportunities for us to collaborate a little bit more closely in a systematic way, and I'll say more about that in a moment. So could I have the next slide, please? So first of all, the board meeting I wanted to mention on the 11th of March, and we go, for new members, just to say that we don't necessarily attend all FSA board meetings, but we do quite regularly have reports to make, and we're pleased to have those opportunities. So this was kindly presented by John, because I was unavailable, had another commitment. So he reminded the board what the so we were just talking about John having gone to the board meeting in March, and it was an opportunity for us, given that the council has been in existence for 3 years, to be able to look back at its achievements. And I think that was very helpful, because a lot of those pieces of work had been, in essence, commissioned by a question from the board, which we then took and investigated. We also talked about our current work, particularly the ones we're reporting on today, and what we should be doing in the future in terms of how we can best support the FSA to put science at the heart of its organisation, and particularly in relation to the coming challenges. And I think at that point we were, I think this meeting was actually, can I ask John, was this meeting held face to face, John?
This was face to face about a week before the lockdown.
Okay, well, yes. Okay, so thanks again for that. So the next slide, please. So in terms of the working group, so those are the meetings I've had, and I'm happy to pick up on any points from those as we go forward. So in terms of the working groups, I think what we were pleased to see is just how much progress we have made. That'll become apparent during the morning, that we've got to pretty much a conclusive position on working group 4. Just to remind everyone that the key question, and we'll be hearing more about that later, but better understanding this next phase of technology developments. And I think everyone was quite impressed by how much the FSA is already doing in the whole data space. We will be agreeing the report this afternoon, hopefully, this morning I should say, to present at the August FSA board. And I understand, and we'll hear more about this perhaps during the morning, that the board is now meeting monthly, so that makes it a little bit easier for us when we want to present something. Particular point on data standards, which will come up later in the morning, which is our number 1 recommendation. And then we'll be hearing from Paul as well on food hypersensitivity. Paul, I haven't seen Paul, you are here, are you?
Yes, I'm here, but my wife's on telecons as well, and so I've got limited Wi-Fi bandwidth. So I'm keeping the camera off because that helps with the audio.
Of course. All right. Well, just double checking. Thank you very much. So we'll be hearing from Paul this morning, but also we're spending our closed session this afternoon on talking about food hypersensitivity. We know that this is an absolutely key priority for the FSA, and I'm not going to say very much about it now, but good progress has been made on a couple of the work packages which haven't been contingent on face-to-face meetings. And this is very much to do with priorities in the evidence space, but we'll hear more about that. There will be some delay, and this means that we will present this report later in 2021 because we do need face-to-face meetings, but we will have a lot to talk about nevertheless this afternoon. Next slide, please. So I wanted to say just a few words essentially about COVID, because obviously it's affecting all of us, particularly how we're working. This means to some extent we will have to find, like everybody else, new ways of collaborating and working. There are some ways in which that's going to be difficult, where we want to do face-to-face workshops like we did for Working Group 3, horizon scanning. And in many ways, it's very hard to substitute for that kind of face-to-face discussion. So we will have to think this through, but hopefully we will see changes in the coming months about those kind of meetings. I'd particularly like to thank everybody for their flexibility, because we've had a good deal of working group related meetings over online essentially, and I think they have worked pretty well and people have been patient, and it's also an opportunity to acknowledge how the team have been very flexible and been able to support us well. So another aspect that isn't really on the agenda in any depth today, but we're going to mainly hear from Guy about how the FSA has been working alongside other agencies in relation to dealing with the outcomes of COVID-19. And I think there may be a role for the Science Council, certainly, in considering looking further ahead what those implications might be and how we can provide any support and really factor those likely outcomes into our advice. But we look forward to hearing from Guy. And I should add, Guy, that it's your last meeting today. And can I just ask, will you be joining us this afternoon?
Yes. Yeah, I will do. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, that's good. So so how we can contribute, I think, in relation to the COVID outbreak is going to be important. It will colour some of our discussions today, but I think this is something that needs to be on our agenda going forward. And maybe, although we don't have a lot of discussion time after Guy's presentation, there's certainly the opportunity for people to ask questions. So we're going to continue in our role during this time. We'll still manage to provide our high-level strategic advice on helping the FSA to deliver its objectives on terms of a safe food system. And that takes me to my next slide, which is my last slide. And this is really just reflecting on our last 3 years. So I know we've done this at times before, but this is now the end of the 3-year period. We know that we've provided advice on 3 working groups. I'm not going to go through them again. We've also provided advice from time to time on specific items relating to the Strategic Evidence Fund and so on. And I think in that 3 years, we have really developed a good relationship, particularly with Heather Hancock and the board. Also, Guy, we've worked closely with you, and I think a lot of our success we can attribute to the dedication and support that you've provided to us. And I'd just like to note for the minutes a formal thank you. It's made a huge difference to the Science Council, both at the beginning to get us going, but also being there, I think, through all of our work, and helping us, being a critical friend, but also helping us to really achieve impact. I think that's been very important. And quite a lot of that success is certainly reflected in, I think, on your contribution. So I'd just like to note formally our thanks to you there. The other thing I would say is that we're getting slowly better cooperation with the SACs, the other SACs within the FSA and other government departments, simply because it takes quite a lot of time for people to go to meetings, but I've been really impressed by the enthusiasm that members have taken this up, particularly, I would say, over the last 12 months. And we've now got people really going to quite a few meetings, and I understand that these are productive, and we don't want over-representation, but I think gradually we're getting a sense this will furnish us with a better insight into what these other SACs do and how that relates to the work of the FSA. We have had some changes to the Science Council membership. Laura Green and Mark Woolhouse have now left. And also Mark Rolfe has now joined the FSA board as a member, and Claire has essentially picked up that role. So we've had those changes. So I see this as an opportunity. We're able to recruit 2 more members. So we will go up from 8 to 10, which is excellent. This means we can have an even more rounded selection of advice, I think, in our discussions. So that will be very good. And I'm grateful to the FSA, for very timely, I think, being able to provide us with that extra resource. And also just to note that the team has supported us very well. The productivity of the last 3 years has been very much a function of the very good support we've had from different staff. So I think today and going forward, we will want to consider future areas of activity. We have 2 working groups at the moment, and these are the core really of our outputs. So it's very important that we choose well, I think, in the next year for what we're going to do, because these are interesting times, and there's a lot more to think about than perhaps just a few months ago. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing from the science team essentially on what on their thinking on and how they've been managing with all these impacts. So I'd like to move to the next agenda item, which will help us get a better understanding here. So we've got a really quite a comprehensive FSA update in the next few minutes. We've got about half an hour for that. And we've got 3 people who are going to contribute here. You'll have seen from the papers. We've got Adam, who's going to give us a general update. We've also got Michelle, who's going to specifically talk about the FSA horizon scanning on COVID, which I think is it's been very good to see that and see horizon scanning really becoming embedded in the FSA. And then we've got Guy, who's going to tell us about COVID and how the FSA has been taking action in response to that. So I'm going to start off then by inviting Adam to give his general update.
Good morning all. Thanks very much, Sandy. So a lot of what I'll say is an update to what you've already heard in the past, and it's all in the paper, but it's not an opportunity to really go through some of the details. So there's the areas of research interest, the Strategic Evidence Fund, sampling laboratories, staffing, and then just a couple of other items that you may be interested in. So with the areas of research interest, you've had a presentation on this in December with a lot of the detail, but to remind those of you that were there in December, and for those of you that are new to the Science Council or may not be aware, the areas of research interest are a cross-government initiative to increase collaborations both within government and with the academic community. It's about sharing, it's about sort of being a much better and more efficient civil service for science. So we're going to use them to lead to a programme approach to delivering our science and evidence within the FSA. We've taken a top-down approach, taking some strategic priorities from the organisation, but also a bottom-up approach to make sure we're capturing all the needs of individuals within the organisation. Sorry? All right, sorry, I heard something there. I thought someone would say something. So there are 4 high-level priorities, and this is graphically represented in the annex of the paper. So we've got food hypersensitivity and allergy, evidence-based food safety and standards. That's a slide update since the paper. Innovation in food regulation and the future of food systems. And as I said, these will be supported by 11 programs. This was actually signed off by EMT just yesterday. So we have been making a lot of progress over the last few months. And the main difference you will notice is slightly how the structure has changed into a 4 overarching priorities and then the programs below that. And we're due to publish a week commencing the 10th of July. So we are making quite a lot of progress with this. And then it will be a case of developing the programs that sit under these 11 areas of research interest. And one of the things we'll be using key for that would be learning from Working Group 5 and the other Science Council work, because as we start looking at how we prioritise, how we review what's already been done, the lessons learned through Working Group 5 is going to be integral to that. So the next item is the Strategic Evidence Fund. Again, this was something you got quite a lot of detail about in December, but I thought that was worth letting you know is I'm pleased to say that we've got agreed funding for the next 3 years with year-on-year increases. So this fund is actually building. So the success of that strategic fund is building over time. And we had an aspiration to commit around about £500,000 towards new projects this year, along with what we've got committed from previous years. And we've actually already over allocated that to take account of potential slippage due to project delays through COVID-19 implications. So the good news story there is we are continuing to progress strategic research in the FSA alongside the COVID-19 work that you'll hear about. So we're not stopping what we're already doing, we're carrying on with that strategic science. A brief piece on sampling and labs. As you know, sampling is critical to the work we do at the FSA to maintain the safety and authenticity of the food supply chain. There was, I think, a couple of board papers back last summer that I'm sure you've seen. And in the last 12 months, we've really been sort of ramping up work on this. We've been recruiting, we've been getting the team tasked to get the work underway. And there's been a lot of progress, particularly in the last few months. One of the real big successes is we've actually established a cross-government sampling coordination group involving the FSA, FSS and DEFRA. So we're really doing this in a collaborative approach. So really building everyone into this process. We've also had to do a lot of work looking at implications of EU exit, because when the original reports were issued, some of the challenges that are facing around EU exit and future lab capacity and sampling weren't on the event horizon. So we're having to look at that as well. Now, obviously, it won't come as any surprise. Again, there's other talks on COVID-19, but the labs have been hit by a reduced sampling as a result of COVID-19. So we've been really using this extra capacity in the labs to see how we can develop and test a future sampling model and how we can better deliver sampling going forward. So actually seeing how we can use that as an opportunity to build. And the final main item was really about staffing. You're obviously keen to know we're continuing to build the science expertise and excellence within CERD. And just in the last 6 months, we've taken on 10 new staff members, some of these to replace roles that are going, some of these are new roles. And we've got, I think it's 12 that are currently in the process of being filled. So we are still increasing that scientific capability within CERD. And probably what's of direct relevance to the Science Council is one of these roles is actually what we're calling a project officer for Science Council. And that role will be active in Working Group 5 to ensure that we don't lose momentum with Working Group 5, and we can really put some resource into that. So Science Council will have some additional FSA resource. You already have Paul working with you on the Secretariat, and we'll have additional resource to put into that work. So as we take working groups forward in the future, there is some dedicated resource. I know this is something we talked about with Working Group 5 early on, and so we've obviously taken that on board, and we're filling that gap. So really, again, it's the message I want to come across with is we've got a lot going on COVID-19, as you'll hear more about, but we're maintaining business as usual despite all of that. Now, in the paper, there are 3 other short updates. The successes we've had with the SAC and Science Council recruitment, the Codex allergy labelling review, which is the first time that social science evidence has been taken at Codex, and that's being led by colleagues within CERD, and Michelle's probably quite keen to discuss that possibly if people have questions. And the fact that we're continuing to build strong relationships with the research councils to access external funding and how we can help steer some of that external funding. Now, they are just 3 very short updates, and would encourage Science Council to offer any comments they might have on any of those points, and also what sort of level of detail you might like, because we could provide you with more regular short updates, because we're pulling these together much more frequently. So if you would like sort of short snippets more frequently of science updates, then we could do that. So it's what you would prefer. So hopefully that's a very quickly fly through, given the time we have today.
Thank you very much, Adam, for that quick walkthrough, very concise. And I think, although there are lots of difficulties operating in this new way, I must say I'm very impressed. This is impressive reading, and there's a lot of positivity, I think, in these developments here, particularly in terms of the number of staff that you're recruiting to bring new expertise into CERD. Are there any specific questions? We'll have some time at the end of the 3 presentations for a quick bit of a discussion. Are there any specific questions for Adam? I mean, I think we're quite interested. I would be quite interested in updates from time to time, and that's something we could pick up with the Secretariat. Perhaps when people make points later, they could refer to this. Any specific questions for Adam before we move on to Michelle's presentation on horizon scanning and COVID? No? Okay, well, there'll be a bit of time at the end. So can I now invite Michelle Patel, hi Michelle, to tell us about what you've been doing with horizon scanning and COVID, and thank you for your paper.
Thank you. Yes, so the Science Council will no doubt remember that back in May 2019, which isn't that long ago, but feels like a long time ago, there was advice given to us on how to implement horizon scanning, and looking at a much broader range of data to try and understand what was coming. Now, I think we can all say with the limits that there are on horizon scanning, I don't think we would have seen what was coming. But in the meantime, we have been implementing those recommendations in a couple of ways. First off, we've been doing some longer term looking at things like lab grown meat, which Adam's team can tell you more about. Then in a sort of 3 to 5 year time frame, Steve Wern and has been working with our strategy unit to look at what the potential scenarios are that we're going to be operating in a kind of longer term frame, and work from that is going to come up to the exec later in the year. But I'm here to talk about the work that we implemented in fairly short order to help the strategic response group, so that sort of subgroup of the executive that was there to look at not the immediate response to incidents raised by COVID-19, but kind of get a handle on what were the strategic or the slightly longer term issues that were going to come up. We were asked to do some very rapid horizon scanning work to try and head off and anticipate the questions that we were going to need to answer to get us through the next kind of 3 to 6 months back in March. So drawing on that insight from the council on horizon scanning, we set up various mechanisms to bring insight into the organisation. Some of these took a little bit longer to set up than others, but I think it's safe to say that we did all of it in record time. And I have to thank the team for some very long days, actually, particularly during March and April. We started off by asking ourselves, what are the changes we're seeing, and what are the implications of those changes to food safety, food authenticity, and food regulation? So we had a fairly tight brief to start with. We started to generate questions by asking the experts in the team, asking the executive, and convening a group which is loosely based around our strategic surveillance steering group, with various additions to it of officials across the organisation at a kind of mid to senior leadership level, to look at where perhaps different perspectives were approaching issues that we were seeing from their point of view. We supplemented this with dedicated resource to desk research. Once questions started to emerge, we had, I think, an initial bank of about 45 of them. We worked with this group across the organisation to prioritise them. And then in parallel, we also convened an expert panel, which again started to grow, but it did from the start include the chairs of all the committees and, of course, you, Sandy, so thank you for that. To help us kind of thresh out the unknown unknowns and what the questions were that we had forgotten to ask. Now, the good news, I guess, the reassuring news, is that most of the findings from these different areas sort of triangulated onto each other. There was not a great deal that any particular method was missing, but because this was such a fast-moving situation, we carried on. We've had 3 rounds of questions out to the expert panel, and we're awaiting that third set of responses for next week. We have from the start been working very closely with colleagues in data science to do some social media listening, but also to interrogate various data sets, including food insecurity data. It became very clear from the start that this was going to have to be a cross-government response, and we've been working really closely with colleagues in DEFRA to help them, particularly around vulnerable groups where we collect data and have done since 2016, that would help them pinpoint, when mapped against other data sets, what the areas of deprivation might be telling us around new food poverty hotspots and food deserts and that sort of thing. So from the beginning, we were asked to do that. It was clear that what we were doing was making a contribution to the wider government effort, and because Heather is on the ministerial task force, we had a way in to kind of share that and get it to the place where decisions were being made. So hopefully that's been a real contribution. As soon as we could, we set up ongoing series of quick turnaround consumer research to start to track the things that we knew we were going to have to look at in shorter order than we could through something like Food and You, which isn't in field till a couple of weeks from now. So we've had 4 rounds of consumer research in plan. We've just got the wave 3 data back, and we're mostly focusing on some of the changes to consumer buying, consumption, and food safety behaviours that we've seen sort of indicated through some of the reading and some of the other work that we've been been doing. The first findings of that research should be published on, what day is it? Tomorrow. Should be published on Thursday morning. And we have actually identified a few risks that we've been playing back up into strategy unit and into decision making. Some of which needed immediate decisions turned around. You know, we've identified that people have been playing fast and loose with use by dates. We've identified that that might be slightly worse if you're worried about affordability of food. That makes sense. So one of the first immediate actions we could take was to put out some more communications around that. But I still think there might be some more actions that we want to take off the back of it. Some of the research that we had to do was more about the why than the how many. So we've put in 2 pieces of qualitative research. One which is about understanding the lived experience of people in food insecurity that we were asked to do by the ministerial task force, and we'll be reporting as soon as we have the findings in a week or 2 back up into that forum. And then another which is more about the longer term effects of how COVID has made people see and respond to the food system and the food supply chain, and what effects that having. Because we're reading quite a lot around people wanting to kind of go back to a new type of normal, a different type of food system, where there's a lot of call for kind of a transformation of the food system coming out of this. And this is just the start, I think, of a body of evidence that people are going to be working on to help us locate that. So I see that piece of work feeding into lots of bigger pieces of work and supporting some of the longer term bids that have been going into the UK RI pot on food systems around COVID and after COVID. And on a weekly basis, we've been informing strategic response group on a Wednesday. So a little bit later today, we shall be doing that again, just helping to synthesize and bring a bit of situational awareness around what's going on. So we do short updates in take questions back. In the background, there's been quite a machine churning through questions, prioritizing them. It's been a real joined up effort across science and data science. And then this wider group of officials prioritizing questions for answer, some that we can answer very quickly, so we go ahead and do it, some that may take a little bit of work being commissioned, but they're so important we want to get onto that. And the key really at all times has been pace. I think the situation, particularly in March and April, was moving so fast that we had to sort of move as fast as we start to emerge from the fog, and we started to stop getting started to get fewer questions through every week. They started to brigade themselves into 6 main themes. Paul, could we move the slide on? Thank you. So the first theme that came out loud and clear was that the economic effects of lockdown had pushed a lot of people, and I'm going to say about 1 million more people, into household food insecurity, or food poverty, as it can also be known. We had been asked from the start by DEFRA to help them pinpoint where these vulnerable groups were and what they were doing. So that was a priority for us from the start, and there's a real customer for that in the cross-government approach. We also identified early on, and I think Adam referred to this, that because of the limitations on how we could draw sampling, we would have to look at alternative approaches to that. And there are a couple of things which are being scoped out now as part of wider cross-government efforts, including ways of using potentially wastewater as a way of getting an idea of what has been going through people's systems. We've put in place a preliminary study as part of IID 3 to understand what people are experiencing in terms of other types of illness, and I think that continues to be a challenge. We identified that there were questions early on about what help businesses are going to need to restart, not just economically, but in terms of the fact that they will have had their kitchens shut for 3 months potentially. So we've been prompting some work with RCD to look at a package of what that's going to mean for businesses and getting guidance ready for them. And there is a piece of research now that things are opening up that we want to commission this week, really, on businesses and what their needs are as they open up and what their experiences are as they open up. Obviously, as things become at a premium, and we saw earlier in the year that some fairly staple food products were getting to be hard to come by and going for insane prices on the black market or on eBay. There is always opportunism, and there's opportunity for food fraud, food authenticity issues, and for substitution. Longer term, we are seeing issues in the global food supply that might mean that is a risk that we need to keep an eye on, and that there's some key products that we're worried about. So we joined up with the NFCU analysts who were also thinking along the same lines, and they've been producing a piece of work with strategy unit that's going to EMT, I think, in a couple of weeks, to look at kind of what the so whats are out of this.
You've got a couple of minutes, Michelle.
Okay, that's fine. I think I'll stop then, and just say that there's another piece going to EMT next month, which looks at the experience of doing this, but also what we've learned, snapshots where we think consumer behaviour has been and is going, where business behaviour has been and might be going. And then looks at some of those macro factors that are changing on a longer term basis, hopefully to prompt those sorts of strategic discussions. And the one thing that has really been key, and one thing we're keen not to lose, is the pulling together the interdisciplinary evidence base, synthesizing it, and having a channel to put it up to key decision makers in a timely manner has been really important. What will be equally important now is people doing something about it, and I think that's the momentum I'm keen to keep kind of pressing the senior people in the organisation to focus on.
Okay, thank you very much, Michelle, for that. We're just going to move to our last presentation in this FSA update, and this is Guy, who's going to talk to us about the impacts on the food system of COVID and also on the FSA. Guy.
Unmute myself. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So I just want to run through quickly the FSA's response to COVID, and I think firstly to kind of flag that clearly the COVID situation was a national emergency of which the FSA needed to play its part in that much bigger emergency. And in many ways, our principal role with the rest of government, it was to focus in on what this might mean in terms of food safety and to ensure that the public are protected in terms of food safety. I mean, as you can imagine, the very first case zero in China, or as the evidence suggests at this moment in time in China, actually originated from a food market. So therefore, there was a very early need for the FSA to get involved to be able to actually ensure whether there was a risk in terms of transmissibility of COVID from food. And I'll talk a little bit about later about that. Secondly, one of the shocks that happened in the UK was the kind of just-in-time food supply system meant that you very quickly had the algorithms which were predicting consumer behavior and therefore stocking the supply system accordingly very quickly got out of sync with that, and many of you may have seen in the supermarkets early on kind of various shelves becoming kind of empty, and as the movement away from the hospitality sector to the supermarket sector happened, there were some kind of pressures in terms of what that might mean in terms of how we go about assessing the risks or some of the labelling. So we work very closely with DEFRA and others on that to make sure that the FSA helped facilitate the food supply chain, but whilst also insisting that food safety was never under threat. And then finally, I think the aspect of the I think many people were somewhat in a rush to return back to business as usual. And I think the FSA have played a critical role with other government departments and with industry, actually, in terms of trying to kind of predict and move forward to what that new normal might look like. If you could come to the next slide, please. So, coming to the first of those questions, I mean, very early on, and very early on in the pandemic, we were asked to work with the NHS and Department of Health and Public Health England to be able to offer a comprehensive risk assessment, which went into SAGE, and their advice then went to COBRA in terms of what the food-based risk was of COVID, and the evidence was very strong, showing that actually, apart from the fact that food might be a surface, just in the form of any other surface, or the packaging around food also might be a surface in the same way as any other surface. We weren't dealing with, say, perhaps a virus like norovirus, which is food-borne as well as human transmission. In this case, COVID-19 in the UK was certainly a human transmission disease and not a foodborne disease. So the second thing which came about, and Michelle alluded to this, and I'd certainly like to express my thanks to Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance on this, in which I had conversations with Patrick Vallance literally minutes after he'd appeared from one of the first number 10 briefings, but he was keen to see whether the huge change in public health practice, especially hand washing, was perhaps having an implication on norovirus, because, as you know, we'd done our norovirus work literally the month before COVID broke, showing that norovirus was actually more attributed to food cases, although than we'd previously thought, although the number of cases hadn't gone up. So we, as Michelle said, are doing a lot of behavioural work in terms of looking at hand washing, purchasing, where people are getting food from, how they're preparing it, etc. But we are still in discussions about how we might measure the public health impact of that, because before it was always quite difficult relying on people to go to GPs and then the microbiological swab to be confirmed. But as you can imagine, in a COVID situation, people with a foodborne disease may be even more reluctant to go to a GP or hospital than ever. So, we may have an under-reporting, which has nothing to do with the hand washing. It's just to do with that behavioural change that people get. So where we are currently on that is we are in discussions with DEFRA and the Environment Agency, who are looking at wastewater as a way of trying to determine localized outbreaks of COVID. And we're hoping that norovirus, for instance, or other foodborne diseases, we might be able to pick it up in that wastewater treatment, which will give us some really interesting situation of, as we come out of COVID and the lockdowns gradually change and people's hand washing behaviours change, we might see in real time some pattern of change of foodborne diseases. So, not missing the opportunity to kind of learn something from COVID, which has massive implications in foodborne and public hygiene, and especially in terms of norovirus, because if there is a second wave and it's in the winter, norovirus, otherwise known as the winter vomiting bug, always puts a bit of pressure on the health system. So as you can imagine, that there's a lot of interest elsewhere in government in terms of what we might learn about norovirus, which helps our work, but also helps the NHS address any winter second peak of COVID by not putting the pressure on food and norovirus at the same time. Could I have the next slide, please? Oh, so the FSA basically adopted some principles during this COVID pandemic. Firstly, as always is the case, putting consumers' interests first. Secondly, to look after our staff. So you may have heard a lot about outbreaks in abattoirs, and you may have heard about the lockdown that's had to happen in Germany because of a meat plant and an outbreak occurring there. This is an area where actually, as I've said before, what you may have in a meat plant is a series of surfaces plus a cold environment plus various behavioural dynamics, which means transmission can increase. And so therefore the FSA is certainly involved in terms of ensuring its staff are safe and helping the health and safety executive and others address the working environment. But again, we don't have any evidence to suggest that the food itself, in that case meat, is doing anything other than acting as a surface. Worked closely with the FSA board to look at the risk appetite question. So there's been several meetings between the board and Heather and the senior executive looking at how we work with the rest of government, this supply chain issue being a classic one in which how we could ensure public were absolutely protected from a food safety point of view, but things like some of the meat supply which had been going to hospitality sector could be redirected into the supermarket sector as quickly as possible and as safely as possible. And now we're obviously working in partnership with stakeholders across government as the sectors are reopening to again ensure that that can be done in as safe as a way as possible. And in fact, FSA risk assessors have been participants on the SAGE working groups, which have been looking at the environmental transmission of COVID. So as I said, coming back to this fact that we are the experts about food packaging and especially the shielded people, in which that was in some ways the only contact they had with the outside world was those food parcels arriving, and which we did a lot of the risk assessment and a lot of the advice onto what level of risk was associated with that. If I could have the next slide, please. So as I said, the progress to date, we've got the considering the risks. This comes back to our classic risk analysis here. So actually undertaking the scientific process of addressing the risk, and there is no specific challenge to food safety from the evidence that we have seen. Addressing the risk management, and that's where sometimes we've had to work with other issues, like should we keep the supply chain going? Even though that might require relaxing some of the usual inspections or processes that we adopt, but whilst maintaining the fact that that is as safe as possible to do so. And then continuing to how we communicate our findings to the public, which obviously is at a heightened sensitivity. And on that fact, again, in this space, I'd like to report that, again, I've spoken to Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance about the fact that the FSA is very experienced in working in major public health incidents and trying to reassure the public and offer an approach which is very open and transparent. And many people have been very concerned about SAGE and the open transparency of some of the expert advice and how some of the decision making is being made. And both Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty have actually recognised how the FSA manages to do this and does it well for the 20 years in which it's been in existence. And so I'm hoping that in a learning situation, even though, as I said, this wasn't a major foodborne incident, the FSA will be able to work closely with government in that kind of reflection. How can we learn from the COVID situation and move forward? And in fact, our risk analysis report, the last report I've written, which outlines this risk management, risk communication, has now been circulated to all the other government departments like Department of Health, Public Health England, DEFRA and others as an illustration of how to do things. So I think that's really good that we've managed to show to them, and the working group that Mark Woolhouse led has been useful in that, in terms of how do we communicate uncertainty and risk and that type of thing. So I do think it's an example where we've been able to help others. So, and if we move just to the last slide very quickly, as I said, we're very interested in trying to actually what the new normal might look like, and we're developing a forward plan. And one of the ways we did this, which I think is good, is many of you in your own institutions may be familiar with the kind of bronze, silver, gold command type aspect of dealing with a major incident. And the FSA is very good typically at dealing with major incidents early on in this, we decided that COVID-19 was not just a normal major incident. It was way beyond that. And the implications were so great that actually we put a command control above gold, you might call it platinum, which we called the Strategic Response Group. And the sole purpose of that Strategic Response Group was very much thinking about the strategic implications, both current and in the near future, of COVID, which was very helpful, not only in terms of this, what we call an enhanced recovery, but thinking about what the new normal might be. And that strategic response group, I think now is again something we've learned from and moving forward on, that, you know, one very much hopes we wouldn't need to use something like that again in the near future, but it does illustrate the ability that sometimes that major incidents like this can soak up so much time and thought that some of the more strategic thinking doesn't happen. So by introducing this structure, we allowed that to happen. And that's it. That's it. My summary, Sandy.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Guy. I think that was very interesting for us. And I mean, also, I think, and it may be that Heather wants to comment here, but interesting how for us as a Science Council, still a relatively new organisation, can see how some of the work that it's done, some of the foundational work, and you drew attention to Working Group 2 on risk, how these have helped set the kind of framing for these kinds of situations. So I think it really underlines, I should say, the strategic nature of the council's work. When something like this happens, and we can see where it is, where the questions that we've been asked to consider, how they really help, I think, in terms of laying a solid foundation, helping to lay that solid foundation. When you have such enormous demand. So we're on time. This is really, there's no specific asks of the council for this FSA update, but we could take a couple of minutes for questions. And I know Heather has joined us, and Heather, if there's, I know you don't have a specific slot to speak. I'm sure we'd like to hear from you at some point. You may want to say something at this point, given the very significant role the FSA has been playing here, especially in terms of, you know, the handling of difficult situations which involve the public. You have that wealth of experience, and it's interesting how that's come into play and been drawn on by other government departments. So who would like to come in? Anybody? Is that you, John?
Yes, I can start, Sandy. Thank you for the presentations. I think the momentum and the outcomes are really, truly impressive. And I wish you the best, Adam, with the BBSRC application. I think that the UK lost some momentum in the area of foodborne disease research. And I think there are many research questions that have yet to be answered. So I wish you all the best with that. And on the topic of research, I wanted to ask Adam and Guy if hand washing and hand hygiene is on your radar. And I'm thinking particularly in terms of the opportunity for food versus healthcare versus the general public environment, because there are still many research questions around hand hygiene. And in particular, potentially, how you verify it, how you check that it's adequate, and how you nudge behavior in the right direction. And perhaps the other thing I would probably ask Guy is two more small questions. Meat factories are specifically, seem to be a problem area in respect of COVID. And does that have implications for hygiene and for food safety? And then finally, how will risk analysis look in the future? Will there be opportunities for tweaking and optimizing the risk analysis process, and in particular, how it feeds into the science policy nexus? Thank you.
Okay, we've got a little bit of time for questions. We're on time. So Guy, if you want to say a few words here, there may be a space later if we don't have many questions at the very end from the public.
Okay. So I'll let Adam comment on the first question, but coming back to the specific points that you raise, I mean, I think firstly, as I mentioned, one of the big problems we have in real time is actually measuring what hand washing or various other things are having in terms of actually, the microbiology itself, because of the challenges associated with that. I mean, we are in discussions in terms of, as things open up, potentially then doing some sort of direct sampling in restaurants as part of the IID3 program. So therefore, going forward from now, perhaps seeing, whether there's a 6-month or 12-month or 18-month period in which things are great at first, and then it potentially tails off again, linked in with how people behave and practice. And obviously the wastewater is quite a nice indirect way of getting at it, because effectively you're sampling, but you're not actually directly sampling. But one has to consider how quantitative that really might be. But there's lots of thoughts, and if you've got any thoughts, John, as to ways in which we might do that, we shouldn't waste the opportunity of kind of trying to enhance that. The abattoir question, yes, you're absolutely right. We will continue to focus in on the implications in terms of the food safety side of things, and the actual safety of workers, that are kind of FSA workers or the food business offices workers, in terms of that environment, to ensure that they are safe. But as I said, at this moment in time, it appears to be more linked to the fact that it's the operational health and safety environment there that is the issue. The kind of, not just the working environment in terms of the surface, etc., but some of the socio-economic behavioural practices of people that work and live in those types of environment. So we will play a very active role with others, public health bodies and health and safety executives, in helping them in that space. Our principal focus has to be, is there a risk associated with the food? And we don't think, there is. But, as you probably know, the incident in Beijing, where there was some commentary about food being imported being an issue. But again, we think it's just a surface type aspect as against anything else. And you asked one other question. I can't remember what that was now, sorry.
Yeah, it was around the process, the risk analysis process itself.
Oh yeah.
And how you might go forward from the learnings of COVID.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I think the main thing there, and I said it in my report, and I said it at the board yesterday, is, at the end of the day, at this moment in time, the process that we've developed is theoretical. We've been through some trials, but there's nothing like actually encountering it for real. And therefore, my feeling is that it absolutely needs continuous improvement. We need to learn from running it and examples. And again, I welcome anybody commenting on ways in which we can further improve it. So I think that's the key thing. We believe it's, I mean, I get embarrassed saying world leading now, because that seems to be a common word from government. But we do believe that it's world leading, but actually until it's been live and pushed and working under kind of multiple kind of dimensions, it would be wrong to say that it's going to be perfect.
Okay, thanks very much, Guy. That's really very useful. So Heather, you want to come in with a couple of thoughts?
Yes, and apologies, I've got really poor connectivity this morning, so you've not got my bonny little face from Yorkshire. There were two things I thought I would add to that, not sort of broader reflections on COVID. I think what it's shown us is, in the face of an incident of this scale and complexity, you have to think differently about portfolio risk. So we are used in an incident to dealing with a combination of factors which affect a particular foodborne disease with a particular transmission route and perhaps a particular group of people. The decisions we found ourselves, and would emphasise that managing an incident is an executive responsibility. It's not for boards to start to decide how to manage incidents. But where I think we had to engage the board a bit more, and we had to put more thinking in, was the combinations of shifts in risk that were happening and whether that affected overall the broader position in terms of protecting public health in relation to food, and balancing that with the consumer interests, which Guy's already touched on. So we probably need to reflect a bit more on that kind of portfolio risk understanding in really complex incidents that have a long lifespan like this one. And the other thing I would say is, and this is really, really important, in the new operating conditions we find ourselves in, it's really important that we maintain our commitment to openness and transparency, and it's more difficult to do it. So giving people the full access that they expect and ought to demand and have been used to getting from the FSA is just more difficult because we're all remote, and the challenges of technology and public meetings and things like that. And also because things are happening quickly, and yet the way in which you communicate risk and uncertainty shouldn't be done in a rush. So I think there's a whole set of learnings. I'm not saying that there's anything that we've done wrong, but I think there's an area of reflection for us there, particularly if, as some commentators suggest, we might expect over the next decades to be in similar kinds of situations because of other pandemic threats. So learning how to deliver our core principles in different worlds, I think, is a really important review point for us too.
Okay, thanks, Heather. And I'm just going to be very quick here. So Sarah's posted a question here, Sarah O'Brien, about whether what you've just said is a useful dress rehearsal for possible disruptions to the food supply from EU exit. And I guess you've just referred to, different ways of working that in terms of the learnings from COVID. And I guess that will put you in a better position.
I think it's definitely been useful. We've done lots of exercising. Nothing's ever like doing it for real. It's given us a lot more understanding. And I think what everybody involved in the food chain now says as a result of this incident is that and the food supply chain has done an extraordinary job in keeping the nation fed and keeping it fed safely. But it's clear that nobody understood how that supply chain worked. And so even in that dimension, we're all better placed to understand the potential disruptions when we get to the end of the transition period, and how we respond to them. But I think we've also, as ever, you strengthen relationships in a crisis, and the strengthening of our relationships across industry, which are already good, and don't mistake the strengthening of relationships for cozying up to, but we need those good relationships to be able to respond effectively when the pressures start.
Okay, that's really very helpful, and I think congratulations all around to the FSA for the excellent job that it's clearly done across the board here. So we're running slightly late, but that's deliberate so that we could just allow questions in this session, which actually weren't really factored in, but not to worry. So we're going to move on now. We've got one more presentation, which is a very important one before our coffee break. As I say, we'll probably get a bit of time credit towards the end of the meeting, so I'm not too worried about running a few minutes late. So we're going to hear from Patrick Wolf now. Patrick, you're going to present your draft final report, which we've seen at various times on data usage and digital technology. And just to say what we're asking the council to do at this meeting, we trust you have reviewed it. We will discuss it. There'll be a bit of discussion time after Patrick's presentation and agree this report. If there are amendments raised during this meeting or within 2 weeks after the meeting, those will be incorporated or be reviewed by correspondence. And I'm going to ask you if you're content for myself and Patrick on behalf of the Science Council to hand over this report so that it can be, I think it's at the August meeting of the FSA we're going to do that. And there is an ongoing project, I'm going to ask Patrick to refer to that, that's going to be reported to our own December 2020, because this is just from one of the contracts. So Patrick, over to you.
Thank you, Sandy. And just to say very quickly, I'm in a situation rather similar to Heather's, so I don't have a great deal of bandwidth. So I'm also not on video, but please obviously trust that I'm here and listening. and I'll sort of talk us through the draft report, which everyone has been well cited on. Just very quickly, kind of looking back for a moment to the points that Sandy made and also that Guy made, I think it's a kind of an excellent primer for this discussion to have thought a little bit about how much of FSA's response to the pandemic has been informed by and kind of involving data and data science. We heard from everyone about the disruptions to the food supply chain and the ways in which that is in many ways a data science and data analytics, fundamentally a prediction problem that was sort of severely disrupted, and then also the kind of the other sort of natural experiments that we can benefit from regarding hand washing and other things that Guy spoke about. So again, I think that's a sort of an excellent introduction to the report. And you'll have the paper. The paper is also available on the Science Council website, of course. And as Sandy mentioned, our goal today is really to review and discuss the report, and then hopefully to agree it, subject to any final changes. Let me sort of remind everyone that we started this work in late 2018, and our overarching task really was to sort of understand the FSA's position and capabilities with regard to data science, data literacy, if you like, data skills and data access. And then after understanding FSA's position, ask what challenges and opportunities are there and how FSA might make changes or accelerate or change course or what you will in order to sort of best meet the future in this regard. Now, the work is essentially has been completed and was completed sort of right before the pandemic hit. So it doesn't sort of specifically take into account any lessons learned from our response to the pandemic itself. But, you know, as I just mentioned, I think a lot of the sort of fundamental data science and data sense making questions are very sort of bound up in the sort of global response to the pandemic, and I think there are probably things there that can be thought through. So having kind of briefly reminded you of the sort of essence of the charge of Working Group 4, I want to sort of jump, as it were, pretty much straight to the second page of the executive summary of the report. If you're looking at the paper itself, this is sort of labeled page number 7 of 28, and it contains the 6 provisionally final recommendations from the working group, and I will just quickly recap them for you, and then say just a couple words before opening things up to discussion for everyone. So the first recommendation, and one that we felt was very important to sort of get out in front, is in reference to data standards and ensuring or at least advising that FSA ensures that it continues to champion an integrated approach to data standards. Standards are fundamental to our ability to operate in a connected data ecosystem, and particularly for FSA, which is a relatively smaller player in the sort of global food economy and supply chain. The interconnectedness and interoperability is pretty crucial. So to kind of realize any sort of advanced vision around making sense of data over the longer term leaves FSA in a position where standards are pretty important and really sort of crucial. So advising here that FSA must continue to work with partners to actively influence standards where this is felt to be in the best interests of consumers. The second recommendation is slightly more internally focused, and that's sort of at the top level of the organization, grow the FSA's technical leadership for data. And I think the reflection from our study of the working group was really that there can be a risk that data leadership within FSA could become too narrow without mechanisms that offer sufficiently sort of transparent challenge and assurance to the executive and the board. And I think this is really this is a function, if you like, of the fact that the sort of data revolution came quite quickly, and so the organization sort of boosted its organic components that were related to data and data science. But exactly echoing Heather's and Guy's points about the sort of the role of senior leadership, executive and non-executive, in dealing with large transformations, we felt that the working group feels that a sort of a more careful strategic look at technical leadership for data and sort of blending that into the FSA structure could be very beneficial. The third recommendation is a little bit related to data standards, but again, sort of pushing for open data and data access where possible, and any and all options available to mandate improved data access to the benefit of consumers, so where consumer interest is at stake. I won't say too much more about this because I've kind of touched on it with regard to standards, but again, this is really the access to data is the primary bottleneck in most cases where we sort of seek to draw firmer conclusions from situations where we now have data but we never had it before. It could just be that the data are noisy and messy, or it could be that interoperability or standards or other things, sort of slow us down. The fourth recommendation, and again, actually the remaining three recommendations again are sort of more internally focused. The fourth being that when we look, I've talked a little bit about the sort of high level of leadership within FSA. But if we look sort of horizontally across time, if you like, again, a lot of work that's been done already has been sort of grown organically within the organization, and there are often have been sort of short sprints with demonstrations of proofs of principle, proofs of concept, and we feel as though a kind of a more consistent completion of the innovation cycle with long-term monitoring of impact for data innovations would benefit the FSA greatly. So we could think about this a little bit as a sort of a mixed portfolio of innovation efforts. So continuing with things like agile sprints, short-term proof of concept, but also having some medium-term and some longer-term efforts underway, and sort of mitigating and balancing the risks across that portfolio appropriately. At recommendation number 5, the sort of the broad FSA staff base, asking ourselves how can we help sort of thread through data capabilities and skills throughout the organization. So we're asking FSA to encourage the development of these capabilities and skills across the staff base, and it's a question for the executive and the board to consider, the extent to which this leverages and is joined up with other efforts across government, and we've sort of seen the ways in which that's played out both very recently in the midst of a crisis, but also as governments change, as chief scientific advisors change, and so on and so forth. But clearly, threading more data science skills and capabilities throughout the FSA staff base has a potential to be beneficial, and of course needs to be traded off with other considerations. The sixth and final recommendation, and then I'll say just a couple more words and open things up for discussion. But the sixth and final recommendation is simply about attracting and retaining, hence also recognizing and rewarding talent. So how to maintain internally the skill sets that are needed, but at the same time providing sort of flexible means of obtaining data skills and capabilities for the FSA. So how many of these capabilities should be built internally through the staff base versus in what situations is it appropriate to look externally for expertise. And again, I would say this is the final three recommendations are very sort of internally focused on the organization and how it operates, but we hope that these would provide, sort of food for thought for the non-executive, for the board, and then sort of to to be weighed and implemented or not in due course with all due consideration. The last things I'll comment on, as Sandy alluded to, are just number one, in the second phase of this study, after looking across existing FSA capabilities, we commissioned a couple pieces of work. The first of these was with the Alan Turing Institute to have a look at future opportunities for FSA to embrace data technology and the changes that might bring over the coming 2 to 5 years. The final report of that study is, I think, just about complete, and it's referenced in the report within the paper in front of you. We can perhaps come back to that during the follow-up conversation. But there is a very, I think, sort of interesting, sort of a box that boils down a number of factors that might influence the readiness for operational adoption of advanced data science techniques within FSA. And if you're interested, that can be found on page 15 of the report paper that I'm working from. The last thing to say, I said I would say two points. The last thing I'll say before opening it up for discussion is just that the other piece of work that was commissioned was around data sharing and data trusts. And this piece of work, as Sandy referenced, is ongoing. I will ask Julie and any others, perhaps Guy, who wishes to speak to it. The work is ongoing, but the hope would be then to have that piece of work reported on separately later back to the Science Council near the end of the calendar year. But the motivation of the second piece of work, again, was to look at these questions of data sharing, data openness, data transparency, and how organizations across the piece can work together in an area such as food supply chains to promote greater data sharing and transparency. So let me sort of pause there. And I don't know, Sandy, would you prefer that perhaps we hear a little bit from Julie and or Guy, or would you wish to go straight to a more sort of open discussion given where we are in the agenda and the timings? Sandy, I think you're muted still.
Apologies, I was on mute. So given where we are in the agenda, I think it would be really good if we could first hear from council members, because we are asking them to agree this and be broadly content for us to work together, you and I and the Secretariat, to finish this off. I also want to note my thanks to Patrick and the team, particularly Ben Goodall, who's done a lot of work on this report, so that's been excellent. So let's, as this is a Science Council meeting, let's hear from members first, and we'd be very pleased to hear from Guy and others as well. So we've got a comment here from Jonathan about complementing the recommendations. So can I invite people to put their hand up? Probably most easy. So Jonathan, you want to come in, and then Paul.
Yes, just very briefly. Actually, as I was typing, my question was actually being answered in real time, so it's fine. I mean, my main comment was that the recommendations, I think, are absolutely welcome, very insightful. But that issue of public trust in data, and we've seen, particularly recently, the appropriation of things like the R number, which is quoted in common parlance metaphorically in the pub now, as to how we are going to behave in the future. I think for epidemiologists, a number of people have been throwing their hands up quite significantly, and so that interaction between data and the public trust in data and understanding that, it's always going to be quite a difficult chasm to cross. particularly as it's not always utterly agreed between experts as well. So it was just to note that, but it sounds as if that's well within the site's scope of the work you're doing at the moment. So I really welcome that.
Okay,
Just,
thank you. Paul.
Thanks,
Sorry,
Andy.
Patrick. Let's take Paul's question first and then do respond, Patrick. Paul.
Sure.
Thanks, Andy. Patrick, first of all, fantastic work. I struggled for the last 2 years on seeing how this would come into a coherent report, and you've really achieved that. So that's brilliant, and well done to those in the Secretariat who've been supporting that. One question that arises from actually Working Group 5, and something John and I will touch on this afternoon, has been a very big challenge to using data posed by new regulations, GDPR, and now post EU exit, how that's going to get enshrined in UK legislation. And it really has affected at least those areas of FSA activity we've been looking at in Working Group 5 very considerably. I note that in this report, there's a very brief mention in the Annex 2 of the recommendations from the 2014 GATT committee, where they said, what's the implications of data protection? And I guess my query is whether we need to put something in about the challenge of data regulation, particularly in order to maintain alignment with EU regulations on how FSA might use data, whether that's needed or whether actually it's not needed, whether we need some sort of direction in terms of the FSA linking up with other government departments to really lobby ICO to have some clear guidance on how to use data for sort of research, science and analysis, which currently is lacking.
Okay, so Julie, did you have your hand up and want to come back on that point? Thank you, Paul.
I did, Paul, and we're very alive to that that challenge, whether it relates directly to GDPR or it relates to public opinion more generally. We're very alive to that. We probably need to maybe have a conversation around exactly that being fed into Working Group 5, but in other parts of what we do in the FSA, we have been working with Turing Institute and the CDEI on AI, and whilst there's a lot of thinking in that quarter in relation to AI and ethics around that, but I think a lot of the thinking and the structure of how to think about each of these situations is very relevant for non-AI data enabled projects. So I think there's a lot of material that can be brought to bear on Working Group 5, but generally we are very aware of that in the work that we do with data.
Okay, thank you, Julie. Sarah wants to come in, and then Paul, and then John.
Well, just echoing Paul's point really about the general data protection regulations, because they are turning into a real challenge for any secondary analysis of data and epidemiological research. And I know it's something the Royal Colleges are really worried about, and we need to have a sensible way of being able to deal with it. So just supporting Paul's point.
Okay, thank
Sandy,
you. And I think that's it. Sorry, does someone else want to come in? Sorry, so I can see I said Paul, Turner, and then John, but keep putting your hands up, or if desperate, dive in, because it's quite hard to monitor all this.
So Sandy, very quickly, might I, before we lose track,
Sure.
if you wouldn't mind, might I quickly reply to the last few comments so that we don't we don't stack up too many? Just going in reverse order.
Okay.
I think the point about regulation of sharing is crucial, and many of you may have seen the EU report released yesterday, or draft EU report released yesterday, essentially flagging that GDPR is places a significant burden on commercial organizations, relatively in inverse proportion to their size. So I think the sort of landscape has changed over the past few years with all matters regarding relationship with the EU, but the broader concern certainly remains, and I think it would be appropriate for us to sort of update our our advice and guidance, and at least make note of that in light of our sort of very current understanding. To go to the first point that was made very quickly, I think it's a very crucial point, and it reminds me of two things. First, that one of the main conclusions or points of the Turing Institute work that we commissioned was that one of the biggest barriers holding back the further adoption of algorithms and data science techniques in this and many other sectors is the sort of explainability and repeatability of the results. We're happy to use sort of black boxes when we are asking for, what books we might want to purchase online or something, but we're much less comfortable using black box algorithms to make decisions that affect public health or fiscal situations or other such things, and that's directly related to the sort of question of public trust in data. And I think in what we've seen with the R number is a reminder that many data-driven models are ultimately a little bit fragile, and small changes and assumptions can result in wild swings and predictions. And that's related again to this question of algorithmic explainability, which was flagged by the Turing Institute report. So I think it all does certainly fit together, and it's something that we should continue to keep in front of the FSA. But Sandy, I know there were others with questions. I just wanted to make sure we sort of responded quickly there.
Okay, so one thing we may, given that this has sparked quite a lot of discussion, one thing we may need to think of is whether we may need to come back by email or by another short call to make sure the report goes as far as it can on this, given that this is gathering momentum now. So we've got Paul. Do you need to come in again, because I've got John and Guy? No.
So if I put my comment in the chat.
Okay, thank you. I can see that. So to John briefly, quickly, and then Guy, please.
I'll be very quick. What I would suggest, and it's just a few tweaks. Box 1 already refers to ethical compliance, and I was going to suggest that we specifically spell out legal compliance there as well, which would address it. And then finally, there was a reference to standards and the fact that FSA would not want to police standards. But I think what should be said is that the standards should be publicly available standards. So we would want to move away from private standards or local standards and have a public, again, in the interest of transparency and trust. The Internet of Food Things report, which we saw a few weeks back, the University of Lincoln report, already refers to trustworthiness of data. So I think you're on the right track there. And then finally, it's an excellent report, Patrick. So congratulations on that. I still have this feeling that with recommendation 3, the FSA is more than capable, I think, of writing a paper on how this area of data access and data sharing should go forward. Championing is a starting point, but I think I would feel better if there already was a process to take it to the next step. And I'm very happy to share my thoughts on that, because it has been forever a challenge within the food industry, how to share data, how to act in the interests of in the interests of mutual interest, and how to obviously open databases. And there are some pilot studies and case examples of how that's been done. And I was thinking specifically, could this be part of due diligence? So there's a big conversation to have, I think, around the end of recommendation 3. Other than that, it's great.
Okay, so I think some of these points we're going to pick up, and I can see that Julia suggested that she talks to you, John, and this is going to continue after this meeting. We'll need to pick these threads up. But Guy, you're going to have the last word before the coffee break.
All right. Special honour for my last meeting. But one thing I wanted to flag, and again, how one builds it in, but some of the comments that have been raised are very live in the COVID situation, and I think there is a little bit of a unique opportunity as that kind of exposes itself and people start thinking moving forward. And actually, Julie and I have reached out, and whilst it hasn't got great traction at the moment, I think it's just in the heat of battle. But obviously, the new Joint Biosecurity Centre housed in the Department of Health is basically a data hub bringing in all the information, which will then feed to the chief medical officers and the NHS test and trace program, which will then effectively, hopefully, lead to much more local-based interventions rather than the national-based interventions. But basically, it's all about sharing data, scraping data from all sorts of places, considering public health and intervening. Julie and I had a meeting with them, and they were quite interested in some of the things that the FSA is already doing, and sadly they've not followed it up, but I would imagine they're under immense strain at the moment trying to catch up on so many things. But I do think that we shouldn't take their initial not following up as a not continuing to do that, because I think through that mechanism I think the government will be addressing some of the issues you raise, because they are rather keen for that to be seen as a success and enable the country to kind of open it up again. So I think that's the route in moving forward to address some of these issues.
Okay, so Heather, you've just come in with a point. Do you want best you say it rather than I read out what you've said, because I think
okay, sorry, I didn't mean to delay you. That's why I thought I'd typed up. Right. I was just picking up on the data sharing point, and I think what we've seen through coronavirus is a requirement for food companies to share data between themselves and with government that normally would be out with their ability because of competition law or the interpretation of competition law. And I think what we might see after coronavirus is some revisiting of the unintended consequences of how those laws have operated, or the interpretation of them has operated. So we might get more access to better data sharing because of that as well.
Okay, that's really very helpful. So I think we've had some suggestions for some quite small amendments, and I'm going to take it, unless anyone says otherwise, that Patrick and I and the Secretariat can agree those. If anybody particularly wants to be involved in that, perhaps they could just let the team know afterwards. And the idea that then would be that we agree broadly on sign-off, and we'll try and incorporate what we've heard today. If anybody wants to see the report again with the alterations, that's perfectly in order. They could let the Secretariat know directly. I'm going to take it, unless I hear otherwise now, that people are broadly content with that, and we can see that people across the FSA are very alive to these issues, these very important issues. So we're going to break now. We've been allowed 15 minutes. We're going to go straight back into Working Group 5. So it's been quite a long morning for some of you. So can we meet back just before 12, please? Okay, a couple of minutes before 12. That gives you nearly 15 minutes. Okay, thank you very much. Have a nice break. Okay. So we're going to just pick up now in this next session. We have Paul, who's going to talk to us about Working Group 5. I'd just like to note that this is really an information-only session. Essentially, it's a public update in essence, and we've got a closed discussion to discuss some of the more detailed findings and progress report this afternoon. I'm also like to welcome Rebecca, who's joined us from ACSS, and also to acknowledge just how much work also, as well as Paul Turner, but also John O'Brien have been doing. So I think just about everybody is back now. So we're going to make a start. So Paul, you're going to make a presentation, and we've got a paper to go with this. So do you want to go ahead? Thank you.
Thanks, Sandy. Right, John Haddock, could we have the next slide, please? Okay, so really the purpose of the next sort of 5 minutes is just to have, as Sandy said, a public update for our progress to date in terms of Working Group 5, and also just to touch on the impact of COVID-19 on the time frame, and then we'll pick up again on the detail this afternoon at the closed meeting. So just to refresh our memories, you'll recall that we formed Working Group 5 to provide some steer to the FSA board in terms of the existing research into allergy and intolerance to underpin this ongoing priority for the FSA in providing safe food for consumers with food hypersensitivity, but also much more of a spotlight now, given some of the events that have happened over the last couple of years that have been well publicised in the media. And so as part of that, a lot of work's happened within the FSA to set up a new allergy programme board to really sort of connect the dots and make sure that the FSA really is at the forefront of the research in this area and research that directly impacts upon policy. And so part of that involved looking at what has previously been done over the last 20, even 30 years to provide A, reassurance to the FSA board, and B, more importantly, learnings and directions that the FSA should take in terms of its future work in this area. And so, as you can see, those objectives encompass both the assurance aspect, but also undertaking a research prioritisation exercise, looking at existing scientific data to underpin those research priorities that have been identified, and then also a horizon scanning of the food hypersensitivity environment to inform future FSA work and direction. If you could go to the next slide, please. Fantastic. So this was our original time frame, which has had to shift a little bit, and we'll talk about that in a couple of slides time. But essentially at this stage, the aim was to have completed an interim report, at least in draft form, for us to then refine prior to submitting to the FSA board in September. And then the other activities you can see listed were to be the priority setting exercise and horizon scan workshop. But that's now sort of shifting a little bit as things become a bit clearer with the impacts of COVID-19. Next slide, please. And maybe even the next one. Okay, so just to refresh people with how things all pin together, essentially the historical elements were split into two work packages, 5.1 and 5.3. 5.1 was a review of previous activity, particularly focused on two research programme reviews that were done, but also broadly encompassing the area around those programme reviews, particularly because the last one was done in 2012, so almost 10 years ago. And then the second was a sort of review of current best practice within the FSA in terms of science and research in this area. And together those will make up the report that we're working on further this afternoon that will then head to the FSA board. The other two areas of activity essentially relate to a priority setting exercise, which has involved members of the public throughout the UK, so including the developed nations, to gain a sense of what the public thinks the FSA should be doing in terms of food hypersensitivity, and then understanding better the existing evidence for those priorities, which can then form part of the inputs into Horizon Scanning Workshop, which will later on form the overall Working Group 5 report, which we are currently planning to submit now in June 21, but may well shift, as we'll talk about shortly. Next slide, please. So in terms of the initial work, we've actually managed to complete this to task, which has been fantastic. We've had very good support from the Secretariat, and in particular, Alicia Barfield, who I'd like to thank publicly, as well as Rosyaram and Chunhan for their hard work on this. So we've completed the interviews that were planned, and that's with interviews with both internal FSA staff, as well as some of the external advisors to the programme, and also some of the people who've held research contracts with the FSA over the last few years. We've also completed a desk study, which was undertaken by an external contractor. We've developed some case studies which we're going to be looking at quite closely at a Science Council level over the next month or so. And essentially, we've now got a draft report which we're going to be presenting this afternoon to the Science Council and then in September to the FSA board. In terms of the prioritisation exercise, so Working Group 5.2, that survey was launched on 20th of February, the public survey. It was also targeted towards specific consumer groups and also other stakeholders, including food businesses and industry as well. That's been a really crucial part of this work. Ipsos Mori have been undertaking the data analysis, which is almost complete now. And the next stage was to take those data and actually synthesize it into a sort of top 10 approach for the FSA using a James Lind Alliance methodology, which we're having to modify, namely because the official James Lind methodology excludes industry, but quite clearly for the FSA, food businesses is a vital part of providing safe food for consumers with food hypersensitivity. So they really need to have a crucial role in that, and that's why we've had to use a modified approach there. We're currently trying to see whether we're going to be able to shift what was going to be a 2-day face-to-face workshop to an online meeting. However, there are a number of hurdles posed by that simply because of the nature of the work that needs to be undertaken, and with the current sort of tracking towards certain meetings being allowed so that we can maintain social distancing, perhaps that can still happen at a date in the future. Next slide, please. And then in terms of working group 4 and 5, so this is the evidence synthesis. Obviously, we can't look at the evidence until we've identified those priority areas. And then similarly, as we've already touched on, it is quite difficult to do a horizon scanning workshop virtually. We are looking at alternatives. The date had been planned for the 19th of October. That's now looking unlikely for various reasons. And so we're going to be working out a new date, hopefully over the next month or so. So finally, as I've mentioned, the mitigations due to COVID-19. So 5.1, 5.3, no changes. In practice, in reality, we've managed to deliver using virtual meetings and so on. I've already mentioned the need to shift the priority setting exercise workshops until we can hold face-to-face meetings ideally, and similarly the horizon scan workshop. And so currently the plan is for the interim paper to be presented to the FSA board for September, and then the final paper at the moment June 21 instead of March, which was the original plan, but potentially that may shift if is needed in order to allow those face-to-face meetings to happen, particularly for the horizon scan. And that's all I've got to update the committee on. If there's any questions, I'll be delighted to take those.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed, Paul, and thanks again to you and John and the team, particularly Alicia, for all the work that's been done. And I'm impressed the amount that you've managed to keep this going despite the attendant difficulties. So we've got a major session on this afternoon, so I don't want to take any questions of substance here. I'd rather leave that till later. And as I said, this was a public update. So is there anything from anyone who really wants to ask something who's not attending this afternoon? Because if not, I'm going to move on to the next agenda item. I don't see any hands up here. Okay, so thank you very much, Paul, and we look forward to the more detailed discussion this afternoon. So the next agenda item is on the FSA Risk Communication Toolkit, and Michelle Patel is joined here by Catherine Clark, so welcome, Catherine. So you're going to give us a short presentation, Michelle, on the development of this toolkit, and I think most people here will see how this relates to Working Group 2 and the work also that's been done. I know the Social Sciences Social Science Council has also been involved here. So there has been a bit of a delay, but we're going to hear from Michelle now. So Michelle, can you do this inside of 10 minutes, please?
I can certainly try. It's actually a joint effort. So Catherine Clark has joined me from communications because we wanted to emphasise that while from your point of view, indeed, it does look like there's been a bit of a delay. There's been an awful lot of work happened in the meantime. So I will trot through it. There is obviously detail in the paper around where we've been. But you will remember, no doubt, that the Science Council produced advice on communicating risk and uncertainty, which was then taken in very short order at the time into a special meeting of the working group of the Advisory Committee for Social Science on Risk Communication, in order to provide a commentary that would then inform our risk communication guidance for what we called at the time Day 1, when we were planning around leaving the EU in March of 2019. So I have to thank the Science Council for the advice there. I have to also thank the Advisory Committee for Social Science for the detailed commentary that they provided, and that was published back in, I think, December 2019. One of the pieces of advice that they gave us was something we took to heart, and I think it sort of struck a chord with the practitioners, which is often when toolkits and guidelines and volumes drawing on the best academic work on how to do this are produced, very little thought is given as to how they will be used in practice. And one of the insights that you gained from talking to other practitioners was that actually, these things have to be useful in the heat of battle. So the first thing we did was conduct a literature review, which has been published and peer reviewed by the chair of the working group for the ACSS, looking at all the other sets of risk communications guidelines that we could find. So not just the FSA ones, which had been at that point recently published, but any other examples in the English language that we could find from similar organisations talking about similar types of health risks in a similar type of context, to try and pin down what they drew on and what they included. And then on the advice of the committee, we took that into some fairly broad-ranging testing. So having looked at what FSA did, they did some consumer testing around the kind of principles in their guidelines, but they didn't look at what seemed to us to be the kind of primary consideration, which is actually how is this stuff filtered through the media. Most of these guidelines say, well, the media is an issue. Actually, the media can be the issue. So one of the things we wanted to make sure we took into account was the perspective of media practitioners, journalists, bloggers, that sort of thing, the perspective of comms practitioners, the people for whom this set of guidelines would actually be useful and used by, and then, of course, taking into account the best state of plain knowledge that we could get from the academic community. So, sorry, Paul, are you driving? Can you go down a few slides? So, no, go back. Sorry. So this gives an idea of the sorts of primary research that we've been doing in the meantime since then. I think it's just worth saying we did produce obviously a set of guidance for March 2019, but as we realised we were going to get a little bit of reprieve in terms of time, we thought it was worthwhile doing this extra layer of work to get what we were doing up to kind of the state of the art. So we did some qualitative iterative work with consumers to get their sort of ideas both immediately and reflectively, and we did depth work with practitioners to really understand where people were coming from. Paul, could we move on? So I'm not going to go at length through the findings in the literature review, but I've included a few here. If we'd had more time, I would. Can we pop on another slide, please? But I think, I just wanted to demonstrate that we did bring all of this work into the thinking around the design of the toolkit. I'm keen to rush through and allow Catherine to talk through kind of where we've landed up. Oh, apologies. Sorry, I've just dropped out. There we are. So I think one of the things we really had to bottom out was kind of what are the different roles in this process. If we've got a message that's going to people, where are the different filters that it's going through, and what are the motivations behind how those people might present it? And then another layer to look at is how do the different channels, given that we're living in an age of sort of media fragmentation, how do the different channels affect how messages are received and processed? And the literature told us that actually there isn't really much consensus about this, but there were some common themes that we could pull together. Paul, can we move on? So this literature review gave us gave us some kind of questions that we wanted to take forward into the primary research. And Catherine, I think you're going to.
Yes, so we whiz through some of this fairly swiftly. I've got a little bit of echo coming through. So I think, broadly speaking, that practitioners acknowledge that there is, with food in particular, there's a more emotive response to food risk from consumers. But on balance, overall, there's no real difference about how you fundamentally approach this from any other risks. It's about perhaps how it lands more broadly. Let's see if we can carry on as possible. Next slide. And this kind of just outlines, I think, the different takes that we've got from those people that we spoke to from the primary research. So from an FSA point of view, public safety is top of mind. When you come to some communication practitioners in the broader food industry, the risk for them is about consumer safety, but they've also got the mitigating the damage to the brand. So that's what they're thinking about. And then when you look to the intermediaries, they also are looking about public safety, but they're also looking to hold people accountable, whether that be the brand or ourselves. So they will be quite challenging in how they talk to us, and we need to be prepared for that one. Next slide, please. But overall, I think there's something that underpins all of this, is that people are looking to keep the public informed, although they've got slightly different agendas behind the scenes there. Next one. And just to note, in terms of, there are different ways of looking at this. I think when we the FSA are being proactive, we've got a little bit more time, we're in a bit more control. We can look at that mixture of channel, the nature of the message, and the audience, who we're targeting and how we're going to go about doing that. However, we're also quite often in a situation where we are reactive. So the channel is less nuanced, we're going broad brush, it's very quick turnaround. And the nature of the message, we don't necessarily have kind of the different subsets of audiences to able to tailor that message. We're going for a much more mass media approach. Next slide. I think this one's you, Michelle.
It is, and I think you know, we find with food in particular that consumers are fairly confident in their ability to deal with the risks that they habitually deal with, and they use various heuristics and prior experience to assess what the level of risk is. We've also seen some really interesting parallels with work we did back in 2018 on consumer trust in the food, trust in the regulator, and trust in various actors and messengers. So really, I think the outtake from this is self-evident, that if people trust and have some sort of prior social trust in the people who are giving them the message, they're far more likely to take it on board. And again, you know, we've seen this in previous studies compared to other sectors, because of the sort of unique nature of food. It's a risk that people take 3 times a day. So that risk has become routine. We often see that, particularly with food safety, people discount the impact and the likelihood of the hazard. And it's not really top of mind until something goes wrong. Thankfully, that doesn't happen so often that it's often top of mind. So compared to other types of risk, food risk can often be discounted.
I think we can continue to the next slide, because I think that this makes a point about the difference between the reactive and proactive elements. So this is where we probably move on to kind of some of the underlying principles that the research has landed on. And this is a brief summary of some of the key points that probably won't be drastically new news to many people out there. But I think what is reassuring, certainly from a comms point of view, that this is fundamentally based on science and evidence that has been tested and researched. So highlight the risk clearly and unambiguously. Be honest and transparent. Explain what is happening, which steps are being taken, and what action is required by the general public.
and get the message out, and where possible pick the most suitable channel, i.e. mainstream news, social media, or perhaps more if you're targeting a particular audience, really get to know the audience and where they are and what they're doing. Next slide.
So, I mean, again, you know, the literature review is published, but I just wanted to reassure everyone that this is backed up by the findings.
So this moves on to the real nuts and bolts. We've landed on some key principles, which are now in the process of being used to actually develop the toolkit that we've referenced. And we've got a first draft of that at the moment. So this is where we get into the real practical nuts and bolts of, as a comms practitioner, what are the fundamental things you should be considering. And I think more importantly, we'll be looking at how we overlay this into our day-to-day working practices. The Government Communications Service has a framework called OASIS, which we work to, and we'll be looking, and many of these correspond quite directly to those, so we'll be building in overt links. So imagery and graphics and how they're used, considering the messenger who's providing this message. Is it appropriate for our CEO or a scientist, or in fact a third party if you're talking to, say, mums about something that's relevant to them. The audience itself, the channels that you're looking to use and how they are and may be received. Next. So we're looking at here the key principles, purpose, what are we fundamentally trying to do, and being really clear to ourselves about that up front. Being transparent, it's in our principles, it should be something that's completely front of mind for us. Control, managing the narrative, and looking at the campaign sequencing where appropriate. And the context. Again, this comes from, I think, understanding who you are talking to and how they will be receiving this message, not just how we want to deliver the message, and considering it from their perspective. Next slide. The channel, and having an understanding of the impact of the channel that you're selecting to disseminate the message. Quite often you don't have a choice, again, in those reactive situations. But when you've got the option to select, to understand those well. Evaluation, if you have a clear understanding of what you said you wanted to do, has the communication delivered what you expected? Have there been any unintended consequences? How was it received? And I think one of the advantages of social media perhaps is that is one way you've got that opportunity for real-time feedback in how this is landing, and perhaps can adapt quite quickly. So listen and learn, I would say, on that one. Timing, constant debate over speed, getting the information out there versus having the full story to tell. And clarity, be as clear as we can about the message that you're looking to get out. And this is where terminology, I think, especially when it comes to things like risk assessments, the low risk versus probable risk is something that we need to be very, very mindful of in this context. So as I said, we've got to this stage where we have these core principles, we're discussing them with comms, we're looking at how we can build these into our day-to-day working, so this isn't a toolkit that sits on the shelf and not referred to, which is used in our day-to-day planning. And that is in initial drafts at the moment. And I don't think this is just relevant for communicators. I think there is relevance for the organisation as a whole, within science, within policy. When we come to have those discussions about why we're making recommendations to communicate in a certain way, we have now got that really thorough understanding, science-based principles to which we are working. And that, I think, is it.
Well, thank you very much to both Michelle and Catherine there. It's very good to see that you've got to those principles. And I'm sure, that's going to be a toolkit that becomes embedded in your work. We have got a bit of time for questions from the Science Council or anyone else about this, the presentation from Michelle and Catherine. I think, as I say, it's gratifying for the Science Council to see this quite comprehensive work coming out of some of the early work we did on risk and how it's linked up with the ACSS as well. Anybody like to comment on this? Is that Claire? Yes, Claire, go ahead.
Hello. I really like this, actually, Michelle and Catherine. So thank you for doing it. And as you were talking it through, I was reflecting how it might work differently with messages I've heard the FSA have to give, say, on cured meat or a product recall, or perhaps an E. coli incident, all of which are very different, aren't they? And from the consumer side, they're very different receiving situation. And I was just wondering, now you've done this work, if you reflect back on anything you've done recently, would you change anything you've done recently in the light of what you've now worked on?
So one of the things we did, and when the full piece is published, you'll see there's quite a lot of things we did, but in order to make this stuff kind of relevant, useful and used, we did reflect on 2 or 3 projects that the comms team had put out, communications around, CBD being one of them, but then we had more, something that was more, I think we used salmonella in eggs, but something that was a bit more kind of pointy, as it were. And thank you to the communications team for doing this, because it's a tough thing to do. We reflected on what we now know and whether that would make a huge difference to what we did then. And I think, I think this was never going to be transforming what the comms team do, because I think it was more codifying what people do by instinct into a set of principles that we can then articulate and base in science. But there were a couple of things that maybe with hindsight we would have done differently, or phrased differently, or had coming from a different messenger, or were in the plan but then got diluted, and perhaps we may have stood up a little bit harder for, not big things, but we then went out and kind of tested A and B with consumers to see what the impact was, to make sure that the advice we were giving was actually kind of going to help. So it's a long answer, but yes, there are some things that with hindsight, not big things, that this will hopefully make different next time.
And I think it's quite nice to have the luxury, if you like, of being able to look through it with that hindsight lens. Quite often you quite quickly pick up and move on. But I think with CBD was live at the time, we'd only just put the CBD story out. And I think that was one of the things that we asked consumers to look at, and how they interpreted some of those messages. And some of that was really interesting, I think, in terms of, there were 2 elements. There was the business element, there was the actual safety advice. And again, had we done some of that in advance, but we were moving very quick. So this is the balance out between the research and getting that versus the speed and the timings of the announcement. It's a constant juggling act.
Okay, thanks very much, Catherine. Guy, you've just made a point by chat, which I think it would be good to hear, relating to who else in government can benefit from this.
Well, I mean, it follows on, Sandy, from your comment to Michelle, actually, in which, I mean, you've probably heard Chris publicly be asked, would they have done anything different, and very cleverly skirts around it sometimes. But yeah. My last one-to-one discussion with him, I flagged that we were doing a lot of work in this area, and he complimented the various things we've done in the past and how well they landed. And he said, moving forward, they probably would work more closely with the FSA, because there can be a tendency of the FSA just works on food. Yes. But actually it's public health messaging and risk communication in a broader sense. It's just we focus on food, but the tools and techniques can be the same. So I think on that sense, I think he said he'd like to hear more, but it seems to me that this work would be really appropriate to forward to him and to say that, this is what we've done. We're continuously improving and moving forward. It would be good to work with DH on a range of these sorts of issues.
Okay, well that's very positive, actually, and I'm glad that you're getting that recognition, and I'm sure there'll be various changes to ways of working after this whole experience around government. Rebecca, you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. Just to reinforce what's already been said, actually, that you asked were there things we could have done differently. I think it's more that we're having these conversations now in a different way, and the more we develop our own knowledge and the more we have things like this framework to prompt the right discussions, the better we'll get at it. And I think CBD was a great example where we really thought hard about how we should communicate risk. And you know, we thought about the messenger, we thought about the message, qualitative and quantitative information. I think this is really important for us, and it's why I was keen to stay on for this section of the meeting. And it will continue to be important for us as we move forward beyond the end of the transition period, and the FSA you know, is giving advice on a much wider range of food safety issues and regulated products. And it's so important that we get this right. This is not an add-on. This needs to be at the heart of how we're thinking about the way in which we talk about risk.
Okay, thank you very much, Rebecca. Could I invite Heather, who would like to make a comment?
Thanks, Sandy. I just wanted to reflect another area where it seems to me that the work of the council and the work of Michelle and her team and the comms team have reflected all of this sort of learning, and Guy and the exec and the board were really joined up on this. And that was the publication of our research earlier this year about the burden of foodborne illness and the norovirus attribution study. And it would have been very easy for that to have landed with screaming headlines about the scale of norovirus and foodborne illness, etc., etc., etc. Even though that wasn't what the analysis showed us, and that there was a very different sort of message to communicate. And I think the time that's been taken across all of our sort of communities connected to the FSA and thinking about how we land this kind of information and message. And that wasn't about a particular public health issue that was urgent or an incident type thing. It was actually about we are improving our body of knowledge. And I think the way that landed is a really good example of the ability to shape our position and how triaging the way we think about these things between all these communities we're talking about really enhances the way it lands with the public and with the media, not just with the expert audience. That could have gone horribly wrong, wrongly, horribly wrong, that set of announcements. And actually it was a really successful communication campaign off the back of some really excellent research.
Okay, well that's all very good to hear, very positive. Are there any other comments on this toolkit? Could I just ask Michelle and Catherine, and you may have said this and I may have missed it, when are we actually going to see, we're going to see a launch of this, are we? That's where you're going to, how public are you going to go about this? Are you going to share it quite widely, or are you really looking to your government colleagues and your own FSA community?
Well, I think the primary users of this are colleagues within the FSA, but there is a lot of interest in this topic around the various colleagues in other countries that we are linked up with. So things like the Paris Risk Group, and there is obviously a huge network of behaviour change specialists, communication specialists across government, for whom this wider application of how do you communicate risk more generally will be topical. I think it's new. I think there isn't another study that looks at it from all of these perspectives, including that of the media practitioner as well as the consumer and the and the comms practitioner. And I think hopefully the practicality of what we produce will make it find quite a fertile ground in actual communications practitioners. So we've got sort of two things to do next. One is, as Catherine said, actually draft the thing and start to use it and test it and see what breaks it. But then also to disseminate it, publish it, and go and see if anyone else has use of it.
Okay, I mean, Guy's just commented here about being that there's an opportunity to be really proactive. And I think that's part of what I'm getting at, because you've got something here that's very tuned into where we are at the moment as a country and obviously around the world. So, and there are all kinds of pitfalls we know around risk communication. So Guy, you're suggesting there's this, well, you actually refer to a huge opportunity. Okay.
There is. I mean, there's no doubt in that. Obviously one has to think carefully about how best to land it, because one doesn't want to land it in the sense of if you'd have done it like this, it would have been better, because that's not what we're saying. but we're kind of saying we've learnt a lot, and moving forward, how can we do things better? And we've thought similarly in that space, and this is where we're at, and more than happy to kind of work with others and share it.
Okay.
And I think from a comms side of things, I'd want to get this landed with the team within the departments that we work with, and then go out from there. So I think PHE were involved, we've got FSS obviously, and seeing how that lands. I think we've also got to set the government communication service, and I think this would be of interest to them, and especially if we can get it directly woven into how broader government is working in comms terms, they may have value there. So there's probably the academic side of things, and then the comms practitioner side of things, and internally perhaps a little triangle of comms and sales that needs to be done there.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm going to close that discussion now. I think that's really been very useful, and we'll watch with interest. So we've almost recouped our time. So thanks particularly to Michelle and Catherine, and also for Rebecca coming in on that. So we've got our last item now, which is an update on the FSA Science Advisory Committees, and this relates to participation of some of our members in other committees. We also want to get some feedback from them, and then ask new members if any of them would like to be paired with some of these other committees. And we'll, after we've got a sense of who's interested, we'll take that away and come back to people. And it's also an opportunity for people to ask any other questions about this cross-working. So I'm going to invite Chun Han to present the conclusions of the little review that you've done on how this is working, and then we've got a bit of time for discussion. So over to you, Chun.
Thank you, Sandy. So as you can see from the documentation that we've provided, we've approached John and Paul on whether the current arrangements were working, and both fed back that they were working well and were quite happy with this particular mechanism. The Secretariat also explored with other scientific advisory secretariats on how arrangements were going, and the Committee on Toxicity has suggested that a council member could give a brief update on Science Council activities at future COT meetings. So the conclusion is that current arrangements are working, and council members could offer to provide brief updates to the council with updates on council activities at future SAC meetings that they attend. And it would also be useful for Science Council secretariats if members can confirm their attendance to specific SAC meetings to help track their contact time. So this is where I will introduce Paul and John to provide an update on their attendance. And I think, Sandy, I may have just trod on your toes there. Sorry.
Oh, you're perfectly welcome. Okay, so are we going over to, sorry, Chun, are we going over to Paul and to John now, just to tell us about what they've been doing? I know that they've both been pretty active. Paul on ACNFP and John on three related committees. So, John, do you want to come in here?
Of course, yeah, I'll cut in. Thank you, Chun Han. I attend the COT, the COC, and the CON meetings, and I've been doing that since the end of last year. I've missed a COT workshop, which happened in March, but apart from that, I think I've been at most of the meetings, and I'm there as we all are as observers. So I've been made to feel welcome. It was gratifying to see one of my old papers cited at the COC meeting when we met in March in Didcot. So I feel a sense of connectivity, and of course I know many of the members of those SACs because of my scientific background. I'm still formulating impressions. The key balancing act for us as Science Council members is not to try and be participants in those meetings, but to be as observers and links with the Science Council. But what I've been intrigued by is the way that the committees actually connect up, and the way that work flows from SAC to SAC. And really, what I take away from the meetings is that the people on the SACs work very, very hard indeed. The workload is incredible. So a wish for me would be, how can we help the SACs to manage the workload they have now, which in some cases will actually increase quite considerably post-EU exit. So that's kind of going to be the shape of things to come, I think, in relation to the workflow that they're going to have to deal with. And equally, I think what we might be able to help with is the overall horizon scanning part of it. And those topics that fall in the interdisciplinary space. These are very high performance silos with people that have deep expertise, but it's interesting to see that some of the more interesting scientific developments are happening in the interfaces between the disciplines. And I think we can probably help there as well. But there is a good sense of awareness of all those who sit on those SACs, what is happening outside of their SACs as well. So I think those are my takeaways at this stage. But to Chunhan's point, I will take up with Alan Bubis his invitation to make an update at the next COT meeting. And I know he raised that at the SAC induction day as well, that he would like to have a more opportunity to collaborate with the Science Council. So I'll follow that up with Alan. Okay, thank you very much. Paul, would you like to comment?
Thanks, Andy. So not a huge amount from me. There's a little bit of a sort of confusion over communications at the end of last year in terms of dates being reset for the ACNFP meetings, and at that stage I wasn't on the circulation list. That's now been remedied, and I've been to 2 of them, but the last 2, so April and then the other one was yesterday, I've had to miss due to clinical commitments. But again, it's been quite interesting seeing, particularly for ACNFP, how they're going to end up taking an increased role with EU exit and trying to almost, I guess, not reinvent the wheel, but almost reinvent the wheel in terms of providing the FSA with the expert background and ability to undertake what's previously been done at an EFSA level.
Okay.
And the next meeting's in September, which I am hoping to make. Okay,
well, thanks to both of you for the work that you've done on that. Sarah, you have been on the ACAF, but it says it's under, I'm not familiar with this, but it's under a process of review. No meetings currently planned. Do you want to say something about that?
Well, yes, I kind of feel a bit like I've been left standing when the music stopped, because I think the pairing with advisory committees happened just as ACAF was being put into suspended animation, as it were.
Okay.
I've spoken to the chairman a couple of times about what the possible plans are for ACAF, but until I think decisions are made, it's difficult for him and I to know how I can be useful.
Okay, well, let's factor that in, Chun, to when we take a look at this after the meeting. Just to say that I have managed to get to the last ACSS meeting, where I made a presentation, which basically was a summary of what the Science Council does and what work over the past year and a half has been. And that was useful. I also had that catch up I referred to with Susie Mitchie, their chair. And I think what we concluded was that when we've decided on a new project, that I would write to the advisory committee and so that they were aware, and that if they had a particular angle in which they were interested, where they thought there could be constructive collaboration, they would let us know. So I have mentioned this to the Secretariat, but that seems like a sensible way forward. Now we have an invitation here also. I don't think I've left anybody out, but I know we've got, of course, 3 new members, 2 of which are here. And I see that, Jonathan, you've come on screen. So do you have any interest particularly in pairing with one of these committees where there's a vacancy?
Well, I didn't come on screen specifically to say it, but I mean, if it's appropriate at the moment, I can certainly comment. I mean, obviously, in terms of the day job, the advisory committee on microbiological safety and food would be of interest, although it might seem a bit like the day job or past day job a little bit. But I'm also particularly interested in the advisory committee on social sciences as well. So, really, we can take the discussion, offline, I guess. But
Okay.
those are the two I feel that I could contribute to. I mean, one question I did have was whether or not there's just a one-on-one pairing, or whether or not that might be shared, or even between council members who want to attend more than one.
I think we're pretty flexible, actually. This is something we've been building up to. We didn't manage to get this really going until, I would say, the last 18 months have been more fruitful. So I think we're very open. I think what we want to do is where can people identify where they could be useful, and then we'll take a look in the round. So I think, Jonathan, anything where you think it would be a good idea for you, or you have a particular interest, regardless of the day job, just let Chun and Paul know, and then we're going to take a look at it in the round. That'd be great. Okay, so I think we're doing quite well on this. Guy, I don't know if you want to say anything, because we're just getting towards our deadline now in terms of time. I note that we've got dates of the upcoming SAC meetings. Is there anything you want to say, Guy, about the workload post-Brexit of the SACs? I'm not thinking of ourselves, I'm thinking of these advisory committees.
Well, I think John has kind of raised that. Whilst it's difficult to predict exactly how much work will be coming through, it's certainly clear that for things like the ACNFP, which certainly post leaving Europe, with things like genetic modification and especially gene editing really coming through very rapidly, undoubtedly, that the amount of work that they will be doing is increasing. But as Adam, I think, flagged, that both the FSA internal staff and the number of experts that have been appointed to our committees have been increased in consideration of that kind of change in volume. But as I said earlier about the risk analysis, it's one of those things that you can make a good guess about what this might mean, but you don't really know until you're under until when it's happened. But I do know that the FSA executive and certainly Adam and his team are in a position to flag with them very quickly if we've underestimated the amount of work that will be coming through.
Okay, all right. Well, look, this has been a useful discussion. I think, Chun, you've got the actions and outputs that you need for this. So I think we can move on now. So I'm going to basically wrap up the meeting now. I really want to thank everyone for their contribution and for being enthusiastic. I think we're very pleased to have welcomed our new members, so we look forward to that. I particularly want to congratulate Patrick Patrick Wolf, on bringing quite a tough and very technical piece of work to a successful conclusion, and we look forward to presenting that to the board. So particular thanks. We've, I think, got the next 2 dates of the meetings already. The whole council have been already agreed, and we've got several other holding dates I'll just mention. I'm going to invite Chun-Han to say something about fees and TNS. And then we just briefly, after that, I'm going to ask Chun-Han to see if there are any questions and comments from the audience and members of the public, although I think we have very limited attendance in terms of the actual audience. Perhaps you could comment on that, Chun. But firstly, just could you wind up just on the housekeeping? Thank you.
Yes, I will. Thanks, Sandy. So just a gentle reminder with regards to fees. I'm assuming no one's had to travel to their own homes today. So just a reminder on fees, and that this meeting does coincide with the first financial quarter. So we do request that claims for time are submitted promptly. So we are setting a deadline for close of play on the 29th of June. New members will be emailed the correct form and guidance tomorrow to claim the appropriate fees for this meeting. Existing members were sent claim forms and estimates of contact hours last week to help them support their claims. Now, the Secretariat will aim to provide draft minutes from this meeting to the Chair within the agreed 2 weeks of the meeting, for initial review before circulating more widely to the rest of the Science Council. That's it for the admin stuff. Sandy, are you happy for me to move on to questions?
Yes, to the last session, please, Trin.
Okay, so I haven't received any written questions from the audience, so there's nothing to be addressed in that respect. However, we do have attendees online today, so I now invite the audience members to use the raise hand function to indicate whether they wish to ask a question. If you don't have the raise hand function, use the chat as well. I forgot to say that. It looks like we don't have any burning questions, Sandy, so happy to close this one.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Trin. So I'm glad that this part of the day has gone well. We haven't had any technological hitches, and it's been great that we've had such a good turnout and high quality discussion and presentations. So thanks again to everybody. Really pleased that we've managed to do this, and I look forward to seeing you again for the closed session this afternoon, which is going to be largely about Working Group 5. And I'm pleased that Guy is going to join us for this afternoon, so we'll be able to say a proper goodbye then. We'll also be joined by Peter Gregory, our new member, who was not able to come this morning. So I think that is it. I just wanted to double check, as we're finishing just about on time, in fact slightly early, we're due to start at 1:45. Can I just check with Trin Han that that is correct?
Yes, it is. That's correct.
And essentially it's the same. Is it the same? We've got to check out of this meeting and go into a new...
Yes, we'll check out this one and go into the afternoon sessions invite. So everyone should have had that in their diaries. Okay, well, can I just say thank you all very, very much, and I will see members this afternoon, and thank you to all the other colleagues, particularly from FSA, who've joined us. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Meeting is closed. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.